Good morning, class. Today we're going to start getting into our regular lectures for Introduction to Psychology. We'll be looking at our first chapter in the book, Psychology, Critical Thinking, and Science. Let me make sure that we are, in fact, yes, we are recording. Before we, hop into that, why don't we cover a little bit of information on the course starting this week. As the first full week after our syllabus and introduction, what I want us to be doing is turn our attention to the sort of regularly programmatic things that we will be doing on a weekly basis. Our quiz is up. This is our first quiz. Pretty much all my quizzes are going to be timed at 1 hour. That being said, this quiz should take about 60 seconds. It's mainly just a little bit of information on the syllabus to make sure that you've downloaded that and read over it. So super easy, but as I've said before, these quizzes are kind of a chance to revisit material that we've looked at before. They're not supposed to be like back-breaking crazy work, but it's definitely something you want to look at. Make sure we get done and try not to wait till the last minute, because that's how mistakes crop up and now your computer won't work and now you're emailing me. That being said, email, as we've already discussed, is going to be the preferred method of reaching out to me. I think I was able to touch base back with everyone that sent me an email this past week, and I appreciate you guys doing that. I guess if you're watching this video, then you probably didn't have a problem getting access to it. But for those that did, I am probably going to just keep hosting them on YouTube, because that seemed like a solution that people gravitated towards pretty quickly. But remember, you can always just download these videos too, just by right-clicking and saving them straight to your hard drive, which might also alleviate some of the problems we've had. Okay, so quizzes. We want to make sure we're doing a quiz. We also want to make sure we're doing our weekly assignments. Go under the assignments tab and check out, see what we got this week. We're going to have weekly assignments sans the basically every week except for like midterm and final week. So you can check out that. Again, that's more or less like a single paragraph, full paragraph essay response. It's not something that should take you days and days and days, and I'm not looking for a 5-paragraph essay or anything like that. Just something that kind of fully answers the questions and lets me know that you're thinking kind of critically about what we're trying to discuss. But if you want to do more to flesh out a topic, you're more than welcome to, obviously. Our discussion board is up and ready to go as well. So we want to make sure that we're looking at that. The one thing I would say about the discussion board is that my goal in that is to get you guys to interact with one another. And to that end, I want pretty much everyone posting in the same thread, the thread that I make for the week. I don't want everyone posting their own individual threads. Like this last week for the introduction, we had several people post their own introductory threads. I just want you guys to post in the one that I make. That way, it's all consolidated so you guys can read and respond to one another, because that's a real big deal for me. I want you guys interacting, kind of emulating the classroom experience. I don't want to just be you put something up and I read it and no one else pays attention to it. So by forcing you guys to kind of post in the same thread, hopefully I'll be able to get you to interact a little bit too. And so, make sure that we're doing that. I said this last week, and I got a bunch of posts that were independent. So I don't know if there was confusion or what the deal with that was. Maybe we didn't catch that in the lecture. So I'm saying it first and foremost today. So I think that's it. The quiz, discussion board, assignment. Make sure we read the chapter this week. Last week we were supposed to read the introduction. This week is a little bit longer, a little bit more time consuming. But I still want to make sure that you guys are reading it, because there's a lot of material that we won't have time to cover in a video lecture that I need you guys to start to assimilate. So I guess without further ado, let's start looking at this lesson. So, we are kind of introducing the topic of psychology today. We're going to be introducing it as a social science, a soft science. kind of explaining a little bit what that means. We're going to also be talking about scientific method and how that's applicable here. We're also going to be talking a little bit about the history of psychology today, to get an overview of where we've come from, and maybe we'll even see a little bit about where we're going. Talk about some of the practical applications of psychology and its goals and aims. And that'll probably round out our lesson. So, psychology as a field of study is one that tries to ask the question, why do we do the things we do? And that's a daunting question. It's a difficult question. And one that is born as a sort of an evolutionary psychologist might say, is born from this brain that we have that in some ways overthinks. You got to think back to the earliest days of humans as a species. We're hunters, we're gatherers, and all we're trying to do is figure things out, because that's what differentiates humans in so many ways from other animal creatures, other primates, is that we have an advanced capacity for figuring things out. When it comes back to early problems, like how do I get that apple that's too high in the tree? Well, maybe I'll get a stick and I'll swing it at the apple and knock it down. Or, how do I take care of this rotting meat that we found off a dead animal? Well, maybe I'll invent fire, and I'll use fire to start to cook the meat so that it's healthy. And so we had this, this caveman, this troglodyte sort of creature, and his brain is just growing and growing and growing over hundreds of thousands of years, and he's learning how to figure things out, how to do things. And you fast forward to modern society, since the advent of history, and we're still on that quest. We're trying to figure things out. It's what we do. We look at the world around us and we seek to understand it, and that's one of the amazing things about humans. And also one of the things that can, drive us crazy at times. We try to make sense of the world around us. And that's kind of where psychology is created. It comes out of this desire to figure things out about, what is motivating our actions, what is driving us at our most fundamental level. Why are we becoming, or how do we become the people that we are? Is it all just destiny? Is it all some random chance? Well, a psychologist will sit there and say, well, no, there's ways of figuring it out. And the way we do that is through the application of psychology, through the knowledge that we get through basically psychological science. And that's a cool thing. It's fulfilling this imperative of what it means to be human, to learn and figure things out. Super, super important thing, and I kind of want us to understand, why that. Hopefully, we would all just see why that question is kind of cool and kind of interesting and kind of important, because it's a big one. Some people would say it's the question: why do we behave the way we behave? But so we say, this is a soft science. Well, what is a science? Science is a methodology for pursuing knowledge that involves theorizing, testing, and drawing conclusions. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we hit scientific method, and we talk a little bit about defining experiments in a bit. But science is the sort of methodology that was created during the Enlightenment era. As a new way of approaching, not that science was created in the Enlightenment era, but the way we think of it today, something that came around in Europe in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, where we are starting to really critically think about, how do we know what we know? And science becomes a methodology for, creating ideas and then figuring out how to test those ideas and then drawing conclusions from these ideas. But science becomes this backbone for civilization and its development. Basically, in the whole Renaissance and Enlightenment area of Europe, becomes a new way of kind of growing our body of knowledge. And it's something that encapsulates this field of modern psychology. So, there's a couple things I want to touch on before we move off this point. What makes something scientific? Well, when we say something is scientific, that means first and foremost, scientific ideas are ideas that are governed by a principle of change. Scientific ideas are ideas that are governed by a principle of change. And by that I mean that through the process of testing and theorizing and experimentation and, challenging our assumptions, we learn new things. And that has been the process of science since its inception. The idea of, the way we've done things in the past are correct because they're time-honored and sacred, is done away with in this sort of scientific revolution. And instead, everything that we know comes through examination, inquiry, experimentation, and drawing conclusions. And like a great example of this, we hopefully are all familiar with the figure of Albert Einstein. But, in the era before Einstein, and Einstein's theory of relativity and physics, our understanding of reality, of truth, of physics and the natural world was kind of governed by Isaac Newton and Newtonian physics. The guy that gave us calculus and gravity and all these wonderful things that I'm sure you love studying in school so much. But, the important bit is that, we had these ideas, these Newtonian physics, and one of the major concepts was that of ether, this sort of mystical, invisible substance that permeates all reality and binds everything together in this sort of like cloud, this invisible cloud in the air. That was ether. Why did the planets circle the sun? Well, they're stuck in this field of ether that is acted upon by gravity. So we have this ether field, and it's this quasi-mystical, almost alchemical at times idea, but it's one that had lasted well into the 19th or 20th century because no one had thought of anything better for explaining and interpreting the world around us. But then we have Einstein come along and giving us his theory of relativity, and from there we have tons of other things. Quantum mechanics come into play, and in the future now we have string theory and all these other incredible ideas. And so we change, we adapt. The things that we teach in school are completely new, completely different from what they were 100 years ago. The concept of ether is just gone. And so we have this sort of like rapidly evolving body of knowledge that is willing to examine itself and say, well, that was wrong. That was wrong. So when we say something is scientific, that means it's gone through scrutiny and evaluation and change. And that's a huge deal. That is a huge, huge deal to be willing to approach our systems of knowledge and say, what we've been doing is wrong. And we need to do something better. We have found something better. Now we will implement something better. That's kind of like the hallmark of this European scientific approach to knowledge. Something that is always striving for more, for better. Striving to change and fix itself where it's wrong. So when we say something is scientific, we're saying something is willing to be changed based on evidence. And so what we have, I just used this word evidence. We have evidence, and evidence is a very important thing in how we draw conclusions. And we have, when we talk about evidence, we're talking about this sort of empirical knowledge. And empirical, not like imperial, but empirical with an E, is a sort of knowledge that is governed by observing the material world. We know what happens because we can literally see it. It's empirical. Or observe it in some, microscopes, etc., etc. It's there to be seen. But there are other types of knowledge as well, and this is oftentimes where people get into arguments and debates, is what we call ideological information. Ideological knowledge. And that's our ideas about why things are the way they are. And that can be governed by, our own biases, that can be governed by our own predispositions, our own desires. But empirical knowledge and ideological knowledge are two sides of this very important coin, because, empirical knowledge without ideological knowledge is toothless. It's just data. But ideological knowledge without empirical information is dangerous. It's dangerous. So we have these two sides of the same sort of coin kind of working in themselves. Empirical and ideological knowledge. And psychology is trying to, in many ways, balance that. The need for accurately studying the world around us with making sense of the many ideological impulses that people have. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get to cognitive bias. But so the goals of psychology then, the goals of this field of study, trying to understand why do we do the things we do, is fourfold. The first thing is to describe, provide an accurate description of what's taking place. And to kind of illustrate the difficulty, we may say, well, that's simple. Of course you can describe it. Well, say you see a car wreck where someone driving a car hits a pedestrian. And so, you're person going to write a report on this little incident, and so you go ask all the eyewitness accounts of everyone who was literally there at that moment. And you find 20 different people, including the pedestrian, including the driver, and what you're going to get is 20 different stories, 20 different descriptions for what is taking place. And so one of the key jobs of any social science, of any science in particular, is trying to find a way to provide an accurate description when there are oftentimes inaccurate, incomplete, or even contradictory sets of information being presented to you. So if you go to this car wreck, you're going to get 20 different viewpoints. And some of them are going to be like, oh, it's the driver's fault, it's the pedestrian's fault, it's the city's fault, because their sidewalks aren't wide enough, or the light turned too fast, blah, 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 blah. You're going to get a slew of variant responses, but a good description is going to be something that kind of weighs them and creates an accurate image of what took place. And kind of as a reference, there's a book by a guy named Nate Silver. He's a statistician that really talks about the signal and the noise. It really talks about how do we filter out all of the inconsistencies, the inaccuracies, the impulses, the biases, the glamorous, the spectacular, to interpret and describe efficiently through data. That's a pretty cool book and worth looking at. The next thing we want to understand, next step of psychology is not to describe, but also to understand. And by that we mean, be able to explain this sort of difficult question of why. In a kind of simple explanation, or a simple example would be, I don't know if you guys ever did this growing up, but when you combine like baking soda and vinegar, and now all of a sudden stuff is bubbling up and spewing out, and maybe you made volcanoes as a kid, doing that sort of thing. Well, a chemist can explain why the base and the acid provide that sort of response with one another, the releasing of energy through the form of gas and heat and blah blah blah. But they can explain the details of why. And that becomes a very important question because, for the next step especially, because it's not just about understanding why, but then also being able to predict what's going to happen. Because, the whole bit about being able to describe and understand, well, now you need something to do with that. You need to be able to predict or forecast certain behaviors. And this becomes a super important thing in this field of psychology, to understand what's going to create behaviors in us so that we can recognize the sort of patterns. And then the last bit is, once you are able to kind of predict behavioral patterns, is to then ultimately be able to hopefully control the conditions that affect behavior. And not to take psychology as this sort of grand field designed to dominate your will and leave you strapped of your own individual decisions to making. But no, when we talk about control, this is something that we probably have experienced or interacted with on a regular basis. Like, take for example, maybe you have a friend or yourself have been like in a really bad relationship, where every time you go see your boyfriend or girlfriend, they just leave you feeling bad, and It's this sort of like toxic relationship where you see a person going into it and then they feel bad, and so they make bad decisions because they feel bad, and now, because their self-esteem drops down, they go back to this person, but that person only makes them feel worse, and so then they act poorly again, and then they go back to them, and so you have this like vicious cycle where their self-esteem is terrible, and they're making bad decisions, and they're not really happy in the choices that they're making, and they're unhappy with this sort of like toxic partner. I've seen that happen before, and what we're doing here is, if we've seen this situation, we would be like, all right, the final step that you need to do is step away from that toxic relationship. We can describe the problem. You're unhappy. We can understand the problem. Well, it's because of these series of cyclical events that you continue to participate in. We can predict it. If you go see that partner that is so toxic and negative, you're only going to feel worse and continue the cycle all over again. So the thing you need to do is change those conditions that are affecting your behaviors. And this is kind of what psychology is trying to do in a much more detailed way, and maybe not on something so obvious as well. But it's looking at ultimately trying to affect those conditions that are driving our behaviors, that are undesirable to us, that are making us unhappy. So what is instrumental also in psychology is, as we start to think about psychology as a sort of social science, is the role of critical thinking within this field of psychology. So critical thinking is first and foremost a skill set that anyone can develop to examine and interpret the world around them. This is something that dates back all the way to Socrates, which is, this guy, if we aren't very familiar with him, it's this guy who, in a time period where people were very mystical, very religious, Socrates was the guy that kind of went to them and was like, so you have all these beliefs in these gods, and, you want us to make sacrifices, and, we're going to be worshiping Zeus, Poseidon, etc., 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 and why? Why? And, we know it to be true. Of course we know the gods are real. Of course we know everything is the way the priest tells me. He was like, why? What evidence do you have? How do you know this? And he was famous for saying, all that I know is that I do not know. And he was this first in this figure of Western philosophical tradition, first dude that was kind of just this overt critical thinker. Who was eventually put to death because he was so critical of those ideas of the people around him. But his basic premise was that of critical thinking, of how do we know all these things that we claim that we know so firm in our minds, and we think we have all this knowledge about what is real, what is true, how we should live, how we should behave, but how do we know? What do you actually know? And the thing that's so cool about this idea of critical thinking, and why it's so pertinent to psychology and so pertinent maybe to our own lives, is that it's actually not like, critical thinking is not one of those things where only the hyper intelligent, the genius people can be critical thinkers. Critical thinking is a skill set that we can actually develop through practice, through effort, and being willing to scrutinize all these sorts of details in our life. Like the lesson that I'm giving right now. You should be critically thinking about this. You should be scrutinizing the information that I might say. So I made reference to Socrates. Being this person that said, all I know is that I do not know. You should be thinking critically. Is that actually Socrates? Can I find that information for myself? Can I look that up? What if it's Aristotle instead? And so, what we need to do, you can do, and just develop a practice of critical thinking. And what it allows us to do is kind of separate ourselves from perhaps some of our own biases and seeing the biases of others, and allows us to become suspect of everything in such a way that we actually begin to pursue real knowledge instead of just taking someone's word for it, for example, or finding the easy bits of knowledge out there. And also, it really helps us to avoid that sort of intellectual trap of cognitive bias. And I even say, cognitive bias is the overwhelming predilection to fall victim to our own poor judgment. Our own poor judgment. Something that we, it's one of those practical applications of psychology that comes up a lot, cognitive bias. Something like the Dunning-Kruger effect, where you overestimate your own abilities. Excuse me there. Or the gambler's fallacy, where you say the odds will eventually stack in my favor, but that will never be true. The odds remain what they are, whatever the case may be. Gaming theory does not change because you've had a streak of bad luck. But so we have this sort of series of tons of these cognitive biases that plague us in many ways. But critical thinking is this sort of avenue out of that. It's this avenue out of that. And when I say our own poor judgment, our own cognitive biases, I'm talking about, even our own memories. Our own memories are something that we can hold suspect. You may, if you were at the same baseball game with the same friend looking at the same pitch, talk about it 2 weeks later and see how much your memories between you and your friend have changed. It's one of those tropes of Law and Order shows that the witnesses recant because they can't remember what they did a year before. But even our own memories are subject to evaporation, eradication, and alteration over time. And yet, in many ways, we are governed by this idea that who we are our memories. Because the only way we have consciousness is through this collection of memories, that we may know that are rapidly eroding and erasing themselves as new memories are being formed. And so we have this sort of paradox of who we are as people are being governed by something that is ever changing. But cognitive bias also affects our sort of social perceptions. Our desire to get along, to be agreeable, will influence our behavior. Our self-perception, our desire to be right, to hold on to our perspectives even when they're wrong, even when confronted with contradictory information. Thinking about social perception, there was this fun little psychological experiment where they were just taking cues, or they were testing to see how aware people are of the people in their surroundings. And do we see each other as individuals, or do we see each other just as kind of these generic shapes? So what they did was when someone would come up to this help desk to register for this experiment, they thought they were registering for a future experiment, but in fact that was the experiment itself, the registration process. And they would have this kind of generic white dude hand him out the papers, like, oh, I need to go get this for a second, and then he would duck down, and then a different one, looking different but not too different, would stand up in his place and be like, oh, here's the file you need. And it was kind of testing whether or not the individual who was coming up to register for the event would even notice that it's a different human being entirely. And most of the time people were unable or unwilling to call attention to the fact that this is a different human being. That could not be. So very, very much this sort of cognitive bias can affect our perceptions, our memory, what we see as real. And that's why critical thinking has been such a fundamental part of psychology. So, as I mentioned, we are going to spend a little time talking about scientific method. Hopefully, all you guys remember, your 10th grade science classes well enough from high school that, scientific method is something that is down pat for you. But for those of us that may not, this is a very important refresher because, again, this is the way that we have defined the acquisition of knowledge for the past 500 years. And it begins with making observations. And from those observations, we start to define an issue or postulate what an issue might be. At which point we then start to propose a hypothesis. So, we when you look at like when you start to look at like why do things happen, um, you're trying to so you're trying to figure out an issue of something that's going on. You're going to make your observations. You're going to find the issue, and then you're going to start proposing a hypothesis. Then you're going to need to find a way of testing that hypothesis. And for example, and this is actually an example of kind of like popular psychology or pop psych, term that we'll probably be using in a oftentimes perhaps narrow or negative connotation in this classroom, because it's the sort of psychology that we might find on like Facebook or something. The type of psychology that gets used by Cosmopolitan magazine. But back in like the 80s and 90s, they made this observation. There's these bullies in school. There are these bullies in school, and pop psychology was all about trying to understand the bully for who they are as a person. And so what we need to do to understand a bully is to really listen to them and really start to examine their lives. And what we can do is understand that they're fragile and broken creatures, and they need help, they need saving, they need protection. And it's they bully people because they feel so bad about themselves, and they can't help it, and it's so tough. Etc., etc., etc. And so pop psychology told us, that if we give these bullies a little TLC, if we give your everyday elementary school bully just a little love, they'll stop bullying. And then there was regular psychologists, scientific psychologists that approached this issue and said, we need to find a way of understanding why people bully. So let's give them personality assessments. And what was found when they started to give these personality assessments, they found not that bullies had this sort of negative self-image, like, oh, my life is so tough, family doesn't love me, life is rough, and I don't know what to do, I don't feel like I'm useful, blah blah blah. These sort of negative self-images. Bullies oftentimes had a very high self-image, almost to the point of narcissism. Megalomania, egomania. The bullies were not bullying each other or bullying other kids because they felt bad about themselves, but they were on the opposite end of that extreme. And so instead of looking at this instance of bullying where they're making an observation, defining an issue, how do we figure out what is a bully, instead of just saying this ideological approach of we got to treat these kids with the care and attention that they need, instead the psychological scientist said, no, we need to find a way of testing that hypothesis, and then we can build a new theory around it. But without that sort of scientific testing, that started to identify bullies not as people with a reduced self-image, but an enlarged self-image, then they could build a true theory around what causes bullying today. And that's this difference between pop psychology and psychology. The type of things that you might read on a BuzzFeed list about psychology might not actually be accurate. Might be an instance of this sort of like pop psychology, where it may tell a good story but not actually be true to the point. And that also kind of like highlights the dangers of this sort of popular psychology, because it was very, very much to go nurture bullies in such a way that's only reinforcing the sort of narcissistic tendencies that they might have. So yeah, scientific method becomes a instrumental way in not only all knowledge, but in how we can evaluate things from a psychological perspective as well. So I want you guys to take the time to read through all of these things in the text, because there's a little bit more details, and you can always Wikipedia some of these names. But when we're looking at kind of like a brief history of psychology, some of the earliest inquiries in the mind, oddly enough, begin with not psychology itself, but this field of phrenology. And this field of phrenology is this field where people start to try to draw conclusions about the nature of an individual based on their skull shape, the bumps in their skull, the ridge lines, kind of like how a fortune teller will read a hand and say, "Oh yes, yes, I can see your lifeline running strong and crisscrossing with your love line," and blah 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 blah. And that's kind of how phrenology in many ways was working, and it had this sort of awkwardly scientific quality to it. This awkwardly scientific quality. And we could spend an entire lecture looking at the history of phrenology and the sort of radical conclusions that were being drawn, because this also coincides with this sort of race, sub-race interest in genetics rise of the 19th century, where people are trying to explain why Europeans are the best ever, and they turn to these weird pseudosciences, and we call it a pseudoscience because there isn't a lot that's actually scientific, but it was held in super high esteem by the scientists of the day. But we have all these phrenologists, these well-respected men of science who, in the 19th century are like, yes, 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 we can explain. Look at the shape of the cranium, and this is why Native Americans are so bold and fierce, and this is, all sorts of negative stereotypes against anyone who wasn't basically white and European, and if you weren't that, then your skull shape was inferior. And this sort of like roots of psychology, kind of this roots of the mind, start in a very odd place, because this is a place where we're not looking at the brain itself, but at the skull. But that sort of misadventure leads us into some of the classical figures like William Wundt, and who was one of the first people that said, yeah, we can use this power of introspection to really kind of catapult our understanding of what people are enduring. Then people like William James, who's the father of American pragmatism, who's also the brother of Henry James, the novelist, which hopefully many of you guys have not been tortured with. But William James is this awesome philosopher and brilliant thinker, brilliant psychologist, and he's kind of like the father of American psychology. Writes some of our early textbooks, and he has this very down-to-earth approach to psychology and philosophy, which from a philosophical point was called pragmatism, from a psychological standpoint was called functionalism, and it's all looking at like how do we actually address and adapt the behaviors and understand these behaviors of why people are experiencing the things they are. But then we also, move from this era of functionalism into behaviorism, which, if you guys aren't familiar with people like Pavlov and his dog experiment, B.H. Skinner, and his sort of like extreme behaviorism experiments where, he was trying to adapt early child behavior. But, the history of psychology also takes, turns with Gestalt psychology, which still has a element that's being played today, because this kind of like wellness approach, this idea of spirit, this totality of relationships, and then we also have the ever constant Freud, Lacan, psychoanalytics, which are still being circulated as ideas of import today. And then ultimately, we have this humanist psychology, which is very, very much rooted in cognitive psychology, with a melding of Gestalt and behaviorism, and just has this kind of balanced approach towards what we think about today in terms of modern psychology, because it's something that kind of blends from a variety of the background, something that is willing to take from the good pieces of history, the insightful moments of Freud, but is willing to also kind of leave behind some of the negative, because Freud's concept of the unconscious the id, the ego, and the superego, are great, and they really highlight, this sort of iceberg theory of humanity that, for the little bit that we might see, there can be a huge amount going on that we don't see. And that's a great idea from Freud, but the idea of the Stella complex that all women are driven by the desire to sleep with their fathers, and all boys are driven by the desire to sleep with their mothers. Okay, maybe we don't need to hold on to that. And so modern psychology looks at the history and pulls out some of the good and leaves some of the bad. But definitely check out the text, especially on this section as well, because the history of psychology is something that we don't get to spend enough time on in this class, but it is incredibly crucial and interesting at the same time to try to walk through the various iterations of these major ideas and major figures and all the contributions that they've had. But where we stand today is that psychology kind of comes to us through three distinct approaches. The first one being that of a biological approach to psychology, which I call a materialist approach. Psychology is interpreted and explained through the material processes of the human mind and the human body. Your depression is being driven by an absence of serotonin and dopamine in the brain, and not necessarily being driven as much by all the processes in who you are, but by this sort of bodily approach. And this is definitely a very important piece of psychology today, the biological side. Because, not everything is just, oh, no, you're just depressed about blah, 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 and need therapy. Sometimes it is chemical responses to chemical deficiencies in our body. This is why things like exercise and sunlight can be so important to our well-being, because we are material creatures, bodily creatures that are driven by material realities. Another super important approach is what we call the psychological approach, which might seem a little awkward or redundant in a psychology class to have a psychological approach. But what we mean by this is a sort of procedural approach to psychology, where understanding why we do what we do is not just driven by the body, but also driven by our habits, our behaviors. The things that, we talked about, that sort of cyclical bad relationship. Well, that's a procedural reality of life that needs to be addressed if we want to understand why we're doing what we're doing. So, we have a body approach, looking at the materiality of existence. We have a procedural approach, looking into psychological realities. And then we have a sociocultural approach, one that looks at the sort of ever-present ideological realities, and I'm using this in a kind of Althusserian ideological terminology, which is kind of like these all-encompassing ideas that are bombarding us about how to live, how to be, these structural apparatus or apparati that are constantly informing us about how we should live. And this is, when I said, we take the good, take the bad from the history, and leave the bad with the history of psychology. In some ways, this conforms. In some ways, this conforms to Freud's trichotomy of the human, where we have these impulses, this id, this bodily. We have this ego, which is this sort of psychological, procedural mind that's trying to navigate. And then we have this superego, which is defined by that which is outside the body, a sociocultural or systemic approach to reality. Constantly influencing us and driving our behaviors. But these sort of three, it's almost like a three-pronged attack for what are we going to emphasize, what are we going to look at, and how are we going to understand human behavior. And a good psychologist will tell you that, it involves all three of these things. It's not merely the mind, it's not merely our habits, it's not merely culture. And we've always had this sort of nature and nurture debate about what impacts a child's life. Is it the way he's raised, or the genes by that he inherits from his parents, and you know, most of us will just simply say it's a mixture of all, So, outside just the aims of psychology, for those of us that may not be, you know, personally familiar with psychologists or have interacted with counselors and therapists, you know, there is this sort of, you know, if you've seen the show Frasier, which is probably a little bit dated at this point, but there is a sort of, you know, stigma at times that, you know, we don't want to go see a shrink. I'm not in this to have my head shrunk. And so this there can be like a sort of awkward image of what a psychiatrist is, what a psychologist is, and what this field is doing in our world today. And I kind of want to take a moment and address some of these. Like, you know, the field of psychology today is something where, you know, a lot of people are either doing research or therapy or counseling. Maybe it's, you know, we have people that are counselors here at McCormick. That are giving time to help students and career advice and future advice, and then they could be classically trained psychologists doing that. It's people that are, you know, marriage counselors, helping children that are abused or sick, or working at hospitals, and, you know, providing some therapy and counseling for people that have been injured. Or social workers that are trying to help the, you know, homeless or the disabled or vets or whatever else might there be. But you know, the field of psychology is something that has been ever expanding, and at the root of all of these professions, though, is still that unanswered question of, you know, why do we do the things that we do? And these are just some of the many sort of social and cultural applications to answering that question. You know, so the average psychologist today is not someone, you know, who is running a Shutter Island with people in padded walls and weird stuff. But instead, they're people, you know, that are using this drive for psychology, this drive to answer that question, in a variety of social and professional aspects. So the last thing that we're going to end with today, as our time is starting to wane, is that we are going to look a little bit about psychological experiments and research. Because understanding what we're talking about when it comes to psychology experiments is a super important part of the field itself. Like we kind of talked about that whole bullying experiment. There's going to be tons of experiments that come up, but they're all driven by, you know, a singular question, which is, you know, the way that we try to propose and test a hypothesis. And then by doing that, we are able to then set up a framework for testing or answering that question. And usually it involves several different types of variables, independent, dependent, and extraneous. So like say that, you know, and this does kind of fall under the field of psychology, because it's something that's going to be talking about addiction and the way things affect the mind, but like an experiment to ease nicotine addiction through medication. Because a lot of anti-smoking medication is just, you know, it's really just an antidepressant to try to help you kick that addiction. So you want to test the efficacy of this new anti-smoking medication. Well, what you're going to do is, first of all, identify your independent variable. And the independent variable in this case is going to be your nicotine medication. Your dependent variables are going to be the things that are changing only because of the independent variables. So, like the cravings to smoke. The cravings to smoke is the sort of dependent variable that will be changing, hopefully, when it's introduced to the independent variable. And, you know, that's the sort of thing, that's what you're trying to measure. That's what you're trying to measure in this experiment. And then lastly, we have all these extraneous variables. And this is where psychology becomes such a tough thing, because you need to be able to account for and identify an almost infinite level of extraneous variables. For example, like in this nicotine thing, so we have this simple independent variable of 50 milligrams of our medicine once a day. We have this dependent variable of cravings for nicotine. And then lastly, we have an extraneous variable. What could count as an extraneous variable? Exercise. How much exercise is everyone getting? Sunlight. How bright are you doing this in springtime when it's nice and beautiful? Maybe that can ease the cravings. Or are you doing this at dead of winter where someone is pent up in the frozen weather and can't do anything, and it's just making the cravings all the worse? Do your test subjects have supportive families, non-supportive families? Do they have tons of smoker friends, non-smoker friends? All these sorts of extraneous variables can influence the behavior, influence the severity of the cravings, and it's stuff that it's terribly hard to pin down. Because what you really want to do is evaluate this independent variable, but you have all these extraneous variables getting in the way. That's what can make psychological experiments so difficult. And it can also lead to all sorts of problems, like research bias. Research bias is, one of those main crucial issues, because whenever you're doing an experiment, you obviously want to get results. And so, what research bias is the drive for a researcher to find something different, even if it's not there, to find results, even if they don't exist. You want it to be true, so you make it true. It's the same sort of cognitive bias that everyone else is going through, but it can affect researchers, and it has affected researchers historically as well. And the solution for that sort of thing has been the what we call the double-blind experiment. So, say you are going to test 40 people with this sort of anti-smoking medication. Well, 20 of them will get the real stuff. 20 of them will probably get a placebo. And the person who's making the evaluations, hopefully, ideally, will not even know which they're getting, and neither will the patient. So the researcher won't know who's getting the real stuff and who's getting the placebo, and the patient doesn't know if they're getting the real stuff or the placebo. And this sort of double-blind experiment is a way of ensuring a sort of neutrality. And we will obviously, these last couple things are going to come up repeatedly throughout the semester, but correlation and causation are two of the defining values for evaluating research. A difference between correlation and causation is, if something is correlated, that means they happen at the same time. Causation means one causes the other. For example, say I wear a long sleeve shirt and it rains. Are these items correlative or causative? Is me wearing a long sleeve shirt causing it to rain? Or do these things merely happen by coincidence, by correlation? And so if by chance, 5 days in a row, I wear a long sleeve shirt, and 5 days in a row it rains, and then I wear a short sleeve shirt and it stops raining that day, have we proven a sort of causation between the rain, or between my clothing and the rain? Or have we merely just looked at the correlative issue? And that's the trick when it comes to evaluating your sorts of experiences. Are we looking at causation, or are we looking at correlation? And that's that sort of critical thinking that we always want to be carrying with us. Are they proving a causal link, or are they merely looking at correlation? And then the last little bit that we're going to mention before we say goodbye is the difference between a case study and a survey. Case studies, is the one that is mentioned in your book, is one of the most famous ones, by Phineas Gage, who had the spike shoved through his head. Case studies are super in-depth looks at super narrow fields of study, usually one person, but it could also be a family. So it's in-depth, of one target. Surveys are super shallow of many targets. So, the survey is the type of thing where they send out the surveys at the end of each semester, where you evaluate your teachers. And these are good because you get kind of like a brief glimpse of how everyone might be thinking about a professor at one moment. What it doesn't tell you is why they might be thinking those things. Maybe you don't know that one student, just maybe they always gives their teachers high marks no matter what because that's just what they do. Or vice versa. They maybe always give bad marks because that's what they do. Or maybe they were doing it all really quickly and so they clicked the wrong buttons, or whatever else it might be. But that's the sort of like knowledge that a survey gives you. It's instantaneous. It may not be too deep, but it's also reaching a large number of people at once. Whereas a case study is something that is going super in depth, but instead of looking at 30 people, it's looking at one person. So we're going to leave you there. We'll be picking up next week. Make sure that we're hopping on our assignments, hopping on our quizzes, the discussion boards. If you have any questions, you definitely want to email me. But otherwise, have a great week. And yeah, take care.